Hi everyone, my name is Ben Lau, Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum of Chicago. I'm so grateful to welcome you all to our May virtual event, Our Stories, Your Museum. We are the only Chinese American museum in the Midwest. Our mission is to achieve the appreciation of Chinese American culture through exhibitions, education, and research, and to preserve the past, present, and future of Chinese Americans, primarily in the Midwest. Our museum opened to the public in 2005. For the past 16 years, we had launched a number of well-received exhibitions. From The Way We Wore, celebrating Chinese fashion heritage, which displayed Chinese fashion heritage. The Chinese helped build the railroad helped build America, which focused on the important role Chinese immigrants had when constructing America's first transcontinental railway in 1800s. To Attic Treasure 2, which shines the light on a number of objects not previously publicly displayed in the museum. These temporary exhibitions come and go, but always attract a lot of attention from our community and visitors. And we have two permanent exhibitions, Great Wall to Great Lakes, Chinese Immigration to the Midwest, which tells the stories of immigrants' journeys to the Chicago area. And My Chinatown, Stories from Within, which tells the story of the people of Chinatown. In addition to these exhibitions, we also create mini exhibits. The most current one is Era of Opulence, Chinese Fine Dining, which allows visitors to experience the fascinating story of Chinese restaurants from the earlier 20th century, featuring King Joy Lo. These exhibitions, along with a long list of our public programming, would not be possible without the support from our members, donors, visitors, and viewers like you. Our museum had gone through challenging times in the past, like the devastating fire in 2008 that led to our shutdown for almost 2 years. Support and assistance from the community and peer museums helped us reopen in 2010. However, the current COVID-19 pandemic had forced us to close our doors twice in the past year, putting us in a very difficult situation. In order to continue to create new exhibitions and quality public programming, we need your support more than ever. We have a link below that you can click on to support us, or you may want to send us a donation check to the address listed below. Any level of donations would be greatly appreciated. May is the Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, previously known as Asian Heritage Month. This is a period for recognizing the contributions and influence of Chinese Americans and Pacific Islanders Americans to the history, culture, and achievements of the United States. Our museum, as part of the AAPI community, has planned a number of events. Talk Stories on May 5th, Celestial's special film premiere and panel discussions on May 8th, Virtual Roundtable in response to anti-Asian racism on May 10th, MoCA Treasures on the Road on May 12th, I Love Chinatown on May 16th, Proud to be Asian celebration on May 22nd, Our Stories, Your Museum on May 26th, that is today, and free paper cutting workshop on May 29th. We also launched a vigorous social media campaign for the month with a different theme each week. The themes are Loop Chinatown History, 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, 1982 Vincent Chin Murder, Contributions of Chinese Americans, Chinese World War II veterans, and new generations of Chinese Americans. Each Saturday, we featured an object from our collections that told a unique story about the Chinese American experience related to this week's theme. Throughout the week, we also shared resources and relevant news articles. Here is a slideshow of our events and social media postings in May. I'm not going to talk, but we'll let the Tavagan band to play a traditional Mongolian folk song, Dingo Dai, for you while you're watching the slideshow. I hope you enjoyed the slideshow and the Mongolian folk song. Tonight, we have members from our governing board and associate board to share their stories. Our board president, Everett Jones, will talk first. After that, there will be a video about our museum. Then our immediate past president, Sulan Moy, who is also our exhibition committee chair, will share her message.
My fellow Americans, what do you feel when you hear the President of the United States say that? Do you feel included or still treated as a visitor? A part of America does not seem to embrace the fact that Chinese Americans are Americans. What a lot of you probably didn't realize that this prejudice on Chinese goes all the way back to the 1800s, when the first Chinese came to look for gold in the Golden Mountain. Sadly, they were not very successful and had to find other means to make money to send home. They had limited skills and spoke little or no English. Don't forget that over 12,000 Chinese railroad workers also helped build the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. They were also met with anti-Asian hate and discrimination. Then the Panic of 1873, economic and financial depression, lots of unemployed workers. Organized labor was anti-Asian, in which the rallying cry was, "The Chinese are taking away our jobs." Doesn't this sound very familiar? This economic depression and political pressure gave way to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It banned Chinese immigration for over 61 years and barred the Chinese from citizenship. It enabled people to openly discriminate against the Chinese and other Asians. The intent was really to rid the U.S. of Chinese. We always thought of ourselves as hardworking and law-abiding citizens. We were not always viewed that way. You probably heard about the Yellow Pearl, Fu Manchu, coolies, opium dens, dragon ladies, the quiet and inscrutable Chinese. They eat dogs and cats. Chinese women were dehumanized, subservient sex objects and prostitutes. Chinese men were effeminized and desexualized. This was a way to scapegoat, demonize, and marginalize the Chinese. They also invented new names for the Chinese. The model minority. They are hard-working. Good in math and science. This is in an effort to distinguish good minorities from bad ones. So basically, history is the answer to why Asian stereotypes still exist today. And unfortunately, Hollywood doesn't do anything to help this. Now we are a virus. Sorry, America. It is time to stop repeating history. We have been experiencing racism and discrimination separately and individually. Now is the time we all need to stand together. We have been invisible long enough. Here are 6 things that we can do right now. First of all, speak out if you are a witness to a hate crime. Secondly, report the hate crime or incident. Thirdly, take bystander intervention training. Fourth, reach out to the elderly and others to help and support them. It has not been very safe for many Asians during this time. 5, learn about the history of Asian American discrimination. Come to the museum in Chicago's Chinatown and learn more about it. And recently, the Illinois Senate passed the Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History Act. This adds Asian American history to the Illinois School Code. You will hear more about it later in this program. So reach out. Number 6, reach out to your local officials, state, country, county, city officials to complain, to discuss, to demonstrate against anti-Asian hate and discrimination. Finally, we should be very proud of the many accomplishments by the Chinese Americans. We have much to celebrate this Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So, stand tall, stand together, my fellow Americans.
people that just last week were murdered in Atlanta, Georgia. People do not appreciate Asian Americans the way they should. And the Chinese in particular had a terrible, terrible time back in the 19th century, starting before 1882, when the United States government said, okay, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Chinese cannot come into America unless they are certain categories like merchants and students, scholars. My name is Andrea Stam. I am the head of collections and research at the Chinese American Museum of Chicago. My career, a very long time, was as a librarian at Northwestern University. I started working here in the year 2004, before we actually had an actual building. There has been so much prejudice against the Chinese that it goes even into today, where the Chinese American history is not taught in schools. Terrible racial stereotypes. I have found trade cards from the 19th century that all are from the Chicago or Chicago area. And so I have some examples in here. This is one of the worst ones. This is a store in Springfield, Illinois. And it says that basically it's showing that Chinese with the chopsticks are eating rats.
We don't eat rats and mice. We like candy, cake, and ice cream just like other kids. I'm happy to talk to boys and girls in America. Here in China, we like Americans and we want you to like us.
Well, the American people really first need to know about Chinese Americans and the history of Chinese in America. And that's almost, it seems like it's almost a secret that only there are Chinese people that I have met who don't know what a paper sun was. And if you don't know what that is, you should look it up. Everybody who gets to watch this documentary, they should know what that is. It's really important in Chinese American history, and it has to do with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And that's the first time that the U.S. government was showing how prejudiced they were against the Chinese. So Americans need to know about the experience of Chinese in America before they even know about the experience of, what China was and is today. This is just easier, flatter to see, but I don't know that that's going to help you. But this is page by page of that important document. So here, this other man who also was a paper son. Yeah.
So where did you get this document?
Well, this man, Eugene Kong, was a volunteer at the museum. That's how we got this from him. Here are the Chinese questions, and here's the translation of what the questions and answers were. Long. This is questions that you would answer as a person trying to gain entry into the United States about the person who you're pretending is your father. You're a paper son, so that this person lives in America and he is your father. And so you have to answer all these questions in such detail that the United States government would try and trick you, so that they wanted to make sure you really were the person you're claiming to be. Just all the materials that we've already processed. These are acid-free boxes. So we have a variety of materials. Here we have some mahjong sets. And all sorts of different materials. We have a lot of teapots. We have archives. We have a few archives in these boxes here. And so this is a beautiful, beautiful basket, more than 100 years old, from one of the first Chinese American restaurants in Chicago. And I can't touch it because it's very delicate. People in America need to know all of the wonderful contributions that Chinese Americans have made to American society. Maybe if we knew a little more about, we, meaning the whole American public, if we knew more about the contributions that not only Chinese American but Asian Americans are making, then maybe we have to educate them and let them understand that it's really valuable to have this mix of different people in our culture in America.
Old Chinese boys run laundries and are washmen when they grow up. Say, we want to be policemen, firemen, soldiers, doctors, lawyers and sailors. If my daddy takes me to America, I'm going to say hello to Jack Dempsey, Mayor Jimmy Walker, Lindy, Charlie Chaplin, and President Hoover. Goodbye, cheerio, see you later.
In the 1850s, due to famine and economic chaos in China, Chinese came to America during the gold rush. After that, the Chinese were recruited to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Over 20,000 Chinese laborers, 90% of the workforce, worked to complete the Central Pacific portion of the railroad to connect America from east to west. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, Chinese were viewed as economic competitors. They faced anti-Chinese violence, massacre, lynching, and were driven out of cities in the West, culminating in the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This was the only act passed by Congress that targeted one specific ethnic group to bar them from immigrating to the United States and deny citizenship to the legal ones already here. This shameful act separated families and impacted the Chinese communities adversely to bachelor society with few women and families. This unjust law was not repealed until 61 years later, when in 1943, the United States needed China to be an ally. In 1944, the War Brides Act allowed the Chinese soldiers to bring their wives, fiancés from China. And in 1965, the Immigration Act allowed families and more Chinese immigrants to enter the country. Then the Chinatowns began to flourish with families, which is the most cherished aspect of the Chinese culture. As from the very beginning of the Chinese arrival in America, anti-Chinese and racial discrimination have followed them ever since. And now with the pandemic, it surfaces again blatantly against Chinese Americans and Asian Americans. Education is the key. The history and contributions of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans need to be included in our educational system. We are Americans and are part of the American history. Our history, contributions, and stories need to be told and shared.
Thank you, Ed and Sulan. Please don't forget to click the link below or send us a donation check to support us. With your support, our museum will be able to continue to open to the public during this difficult time. Your donations will make a big difference. Now we will have our associate board to share the messages. Then there will be a second video about our museum, followed by a personal story of our board member, Ada Chen.
This year and the past year have been really eventful times. We've had so many things happening, both locally, nationally, globally, and particularly we're thinking in Asian Pacific American Heritage Month about anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian racism. We remember, of course, the tragic shootings in Atlanta with the victims at the spa, Chinese and Korean American victims. We also remember our Sikh American victims in the Indianapolis shooting, who were workers at a FedEx warehouse. So as we reflect on these different events and we think about sort of the role of ethnic museums in our society today as we confront these issues, we had a couple of different questions and thoughts that we as the associate board wanted to reflect on together and share some of our thoughts with you as well. So maybe we'll just start things off by asking, what do we think of when we hear about anti-Asian hate?
When I think of anti-Asian hate, well, I think of so many things. I think about like the history of violence against East and Southeast and South Asians in the US, and how for a long time there was a lot of animosity and the old stuff coming back. It's just like there was a little piece of, Band-Aid tape that now is just on this huge wound, and now the Band-Aid is sort of being ripped off, but it's always been a wound there.
When I think of anti-Asian hate, I think of the relationship that the U.S. government and the Western world has with Asia, and how that has affected many people with those identities, and how it's always connected to war, and how it's always connected to conquering Asia and taking away rights for a lot of Asian people. And some examples of that is like when we talk about the Vietnam War, it just makes me think that almost every Asian country in the world has faced some type of tyranny from Western world, based on the Western world trying to get some type of compliance from Asians to submit to white supremacy. And even though that may be controversial, I do think that that war and causing hate towards Asians because of this war and has led to a lot of anti-Asian sentiment within the U.S.
When I first think of anti-Asian hate, I initially think of, the first contemporary modern day, what we think of anti-Asian hate with the rise of anti-Asian violence, with the rise of COVID cases. But I also start to think about the long historical history of anti-Asian hate in the US specifically. I think about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I think about how Chinese Americans have been discriminated against during the Cold War, have been thinking also about the long-term impacts of hate within the broader Asian American community, with Japanese Americans being interned in camps, and thinking about how Filipino Americans have experienced colonization because of the U.S. and the wars and that the U.S. has created in Asia. But I also continue about how that large Asian hate, anti-Asian hate, with the large scale of violence, but also how it happens on an everyday level with microaggressions, with, being confused for the other Asian person in the room, or even being hypersexualized as an Asian American woman, and how that is an everyday unfortunate occurrence of how we exist in the world. So I really think about how hate can be such a big term and can mean so much, with physical violence, hate, and also how it goes to individual, emotional, with interpersonal relationships.
As we're talking about how complex this idea of Asian American, AAPI, et cetera, actually is, we're here, supporting a Chinese American museum. So I'm curious what you all think about how learning about Chinese American history in particular has shaped your understanding of anti-Asian racism, or, the history of racism in America more broadly.
For me, working with the Chinese American Museum of Chicago and also working in Chicago's Chinatown has really made me question my understanding of what being Chinese means. I also started learning about, like my ancestors and how my ancestors, my ancestors' stories too. So I think that's really cool for the museum to be able to like show this side of Chinese identity that maybe, even Chinese people don't get to learn about.
I think that learning about Chinese American history has shaped my understanding of anti-Asian hate, kind of racism, in the sense that, like, I think I've kind of come to really appreciate how cyclical and opportunistic I think racism can be. So when we think about like anti-Asian racism, sort of what happened was like, the Chinese came to the United States in the first major wave in like the 1850s and 60s, and they were kind of the target of like the bulk of anti-Asian hate. All right, then Chinese Exclusion Act kind of cuts off that wave of immigration. Japanese immigrants come in and they kind of inherit this anti-Chinese hate. And then when Japanese immigration is finally excluded in the 1920s, then of course you have, Koreans, South Asians, Filipinos coming in, and they kind of inherit, right, this sort of racism. And I think that in a lot of ways, our communities have sort of understood maybe implicitly how that process works, because you see when you study history, you see examples of Asian communities kind of turning against each other when it works for them. So when I think about World War II, for instance, and the incarceration of Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans were going around with buttons and passports saying, "I am Chinese," certified by the Chinese American Citizens Alliance. And it's not necessarily because Asians are, also prejudiced or racist, although there certainly are those elements within our communities, but it is because of self-preservation in this sort of a society where people are forced to kind of be pitted against one another. So I think, one of the things that I appreciate when we learn about Chinese American history is just, racism is cyclical, racism is opportunistic, and I think that there are ways that we see that happening now.
I remember the first time I learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese internment camps, during my Intro to Asian American Studies class at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And, I like to think that, during my, high school years at a CPS selective enrollment high school, Northside Prep, shout out, that I would have learned about that in the AP US history course. But, like maybe they mentioned it, maybe a sentence, but definitely not to the extent of like, wow, like the Chinese were the first group to be barred from entering the United States from the, Chinese Exclusion Act. So that in and of itself, learning about that, and me considering myself Chinese American, and I'm also Cantonese, it really hurts me to see how much, xenophobia there is still out there, the rejection of the other. And so anytime I hear about anti-Asian hate or racism and I see the videos online, say, for example, the Atlanta shootings, the Atlanta spa shootings, I felt numb that day and the following day, because that was also like the week before finals for my grad school. And I couldn't bring myself to call my mom, who was a beauty salon owner in Chicago, Chinatown, because I was still grappling with what was going on. And it wasn't until the day after, so it happened on a Tuesday, I remember this very clearly. And the day after, on Wednesday, my school, the Asian Pacific Islander Middle Eastern Desi American Program and Services, I know it's a mouthful, but our APA program hosted a, support group for, any AAPI affiliated students. And when I went there, that's when I finally shared how scared I was for my family. Both my parents work at the salon. That's, that has financed my education to even be a graduate student, about to graduate with my master's degree. Like, I called my mom, I said, Mom, like, are you okay? She's like, yeah, I'm okay. What happened? I was like, you don't know what happened? And, again, like that time when I called her, and this was after the support group, but like when I called her, she was busy, working. And so I had to call her at night and then tell her what happened. And she was like, oh, it's fine. I'm okay. But, like what I'm trying to say is that these are happening to us, everyday Americans, everyday Asian Americans. We are not, we're not new here. We've been here since the 1800s or earlier. And to see that, our history so quickly wiped away, erased, disregarded is an insult. So that's why for me, like, it's so important for me as a young Asian American, young adult to continue to be involved in Asian American issues and to get involved in, museums such as CAMOC. And, I have to say, like, this past year, getting to meet my fellow associate board members has been a joy. Even though we're cross country, I'm here in California, they're over there in Chicago, but like, I really have been enjoying, just like the talks that we've had, the check-ins that we do at the beginning of each meeting. Like, that is something that I look forward to, and also like helps me with, my Chinese American history.
I definitely agree with you. And thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that about you, Ada, and I really appreciate you sharing that. I definitely can empathize with your sentiment of not really learning about Chinese American history until after high school. I went to a CPS school, also went to Stockton Roman High School, also took AP US history, and we learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it was like, oh, that's it. It happened. The president was just like, oh yeah, we're going to exclude Chinese Americans, and then that's all they really talked about. And it wasn't until like my own personal interest to want to learn about our history in the US, like what you just said, Chinese people have been in North America longer than the United States has been founded. Like, there's been Chinese people that have immigrated to Latin America like in the 1600s, like way before the foundation of this country. And just understanding that and even knowing that has been so powerful to think about Asian American activism within the early, like even 1900s. Like, people don't really talk about it, but it's activism in a small scale, which like combating against hate, against people killing people who look like us, and it transforming into against discrimination within the 60s because of communism, and also just, aligning with the civil rights movement and thinking about how that's being transformed now has been really powerful. With anti-Asian hate and racism, it's just learning about our history and learning about how we've fought against and been fighting against systemic racism, systemic powers, and also thinking about how we can grow. And I love also continuing to learn from each other. I learned so much from the other associate board members, whether it's about how museums work from Melissa, or even thinking about what's going on within the community from Consuelo and Angela, and just everything in between has been so powerful.
How are you talking with friends and relatives about anti-Asian racism?
Truly just bringing up the topic of, have you seen this? Because it is, a lot of times people either haven't seen it because they're not reading the news, because they're just exhausted about life generally, and because it doesn't affect them, because some of my friends and family are not Asian American, or they're not Asian to begin with. So they're not seeing or feeling or experiencing it. It's not something that's pressing or pertinent to them. So it's not even on their radar. How I'm doing it is just, we're trying to just get a conversation started. And so a lot of times that is hard and rough and uncomfortable, and they're awkward and clumsy conversations, but we're just going for it.
I think I'll add that, I definitely think that, even that small step is really important. I've heard this as well from some of my other non-Asian friends, that like just breaching that topic is important, because you're right. I think a lot of people don't think something matters unless it affects them directly. And so I think just, even challenging somebody to kind of open up their way of thinking to think like, what is happening to somebody else and why should I care? Why does that matter? I think that's an important and necessary step on its own.
What role do you think ethnic museums such as, Chinese American Museum of Chicago have in fighting against anti-Asian hate?
With ethnic museums such as the Chinese American Museum in Chicago is really educating people on our histories of being here. I think there's a misconception and a stereotype within the US and really around the world, I would argue, that Asians are always the other, they're always foreign, they don't necessarily belong in places that are not predominantly Asian, So with ethnic museums is really such as Chinese American Museum, I would even argue like other cultural institutions where Asian Americans, not white people, not white immigrants are coming into the US is really educating our history. How did we get here? Why did we come here? What power did we have in whether entering or not entering? And really talking about the violence that non-white people have gone through and Asian people specifically have gone through within our country, and really talking about that and really talking about also the challenges, but also the celebrations that we have and have brought to this country and have created.
I think ethnic museums have a really big role in fighting anti-Asian hate and other forms of racism because on the one hand, without these sort of movements in civil rights and these movements that fight racism, these museums wouldn't even be able to exist. The history of people of color are erased and are just not told at all because of, racism. So the fact that these museums are able to exist is because of the work that people have done in the past to fight racism.
I think that, ethnic museums are incredibly important in fighting anti-Asian hate and other forms of racism because they're community stakeholders with a really unique kind of purpose and vision and a unique set of supporters behind them. So, museums can do a lot of work to pushing forward, some of the changes that are really necessary. I think a really important example of sort of, something that museums can also be involved in is things like the recent TEACH Act, the Teaching Equitable Asian American Community History Act, which recently passed the Illinois House, I think last month. And I think, as I understand it, it still has yet to be passed by the Senate. And I think it's going to be under discussion. But these sorts of legislation that encourage the teaching of Asian American history, that encourage the teaching of minority histories are incredibly valuable to making sure that people remember who Asian Americans are, that we remember who, racial minorities in the United States are, and that we don't just show up in the media when something awful and tragic happens to our communities. I think something that this conversation is also making me reflect upon is just that, we've been talking about sort of the ethnic museum, and CAMOC is like an entity that has this important role. But, as associate board members, we're part of that work as well, right? I think that we're all, dedicated to the museum because of what it represents to the history and of this community, to the future of it as well, right? As we kind of preserve where Chinatown has come from and where it's going, and as we continue to try to push this narrative towards, not just education and outreach and community building, but really towards, greater racial equality and progress. So as we've been reflecting on sort of the challenges and opportunities that Asian American communities face, I'm also curious to maybe take this conversation in a more kind of optimistic angle. So I'm curious what actions you've seen or done that you found really meaningful in these times. We have so many things going on beyond just anti-Asian hate. So what's kind of giving you hope these days?
I just want to take this time to really highlight two of our associate board members, Consuela and Angela. They recently started a nonprofit called People Matter, and they've really, started to do some good work of, cross-cultural learning, between the Black community and the Chinese community. Something that they did recently is celebrating Black heroes in Chinatown. Like, to see that on social media, and it was really meaningful for me because I grew up seeing those, Black heroes when I was growing up. And so it's really meaningful and, really touching. And I'm so glad that, they're doing this work.
For me, what I've found really meaningful this past year is people reclaiming their agency, specifically over their names and the importance of pronouncing names appropriately. A couple of things come to mind. The first being Hassan Minhaj, when he was talking about how to pronounce his name and how the evolution of going from Hassan Minhaj just on the Daily Show, just whatever, to saying, no, we're going to take a moment and we're going to all learn, this is how we say my name. This is my name. To even just the reporting of the news, if we think back to Atlanta and people calling for reporters to take the time and the moment to learn and pay respect to these people, say their names right, do the learning. So I've really appreciated that for this moment. And I hope that continues.
Something that I think has been really meaningful during these times is, I love all of the outreach. I really appreciate that. I think it is absolutely meaningful. I think something that I also appreciate is the initiative that people are taking to educate themselves. And, this isn't just, people who may not identify as Asian, but like people within my own family, folks who I think for a long time have kind of lived in the way that Angela was talking about, thinking that, East Asians, South Asians, like, we're good, we got it made, we're socioeconomically upwardly mobile, and, racism isn't a problem that affects Asians as much. I've had relatives who kind of lived with this way of thinking. And I think that, one of the really positive, ironically, the positive things that has come out of this year is that these folks are thinking a little bit more reflectively. I've had in my family group chat, people encouraging each other to take bystander intervention training, for instance. And I think that's absolutely incredible. I think that moments like this really do encourage a lot of self-reflection. And I think that can be really productive and really, powerful. And, I would encourage, my friends here and other viewers to also consider bystander intervention training and supporting other Asian American organizations, and learning ways to get involved to make sure that, we can make this year really count,
All right. See you all later.
Bye.
See you.
There was a voice in the Chinese community that the history and culture of the organizations, of the families and individuals living in the Chinese community has to be reserved. To start a museum was very challenging and difficult without support and funding. Raymond Lee donated over $600,000 to purchase this building with one term. The term is that they had to open the museum within 1 year. Since time was rushed, so everybody chipped in and tried to start the museum. So the museum was opened to the public in May 2005. But unfortunately in 2008, there was a fire.
It was devastating fire.
The fire started on the third floor. It destroyed a lot of the artifacts and collections on the third floor.
We were in the process of renovating this building, and we had already renovated the first 2 floors, and we were going to start on the 3rd floor. Floor by floor we were renovating, and then we had a fire on the 3rd floor. It was most of our collections at the time were on the 3rd floor.
After the fire, the museum appealed to the community and asked for donation and support to renovate the building, install devices that can detect the fire. The museum reopened in 2010. This is a corner of our Sunshine Room. In the past, the Chinese immigrants, they sell a lot of stuff. You've never watched this one, right? Yes. During the pandemic, there are a lot of challenges for all the business here in Chinatown. We are no exceptions. We need donations more than ever. We need donations to help us continue to operate and to continue to provide quality public programming and to launch new exhibitions.
Dear university staff, hello. I want to report an insulting incident that happened to us today. My friends and I were at this building trying to grab some coffee. We were waiting in line, and finally, when it was our turn to order, we stepped forward. During that short time, we heard an absurd racist joke that people at the cashier made saying, "Watch out for the coronavirus." As everybody knows, the coronavirus is a global issue that has taken away more than 500 innocent lives. Treating us as that virus is both humiliating and insulting to the people who are suffering and fighting for that contagious disease. It is very unfortunate that this occurred during the Black History Month, the month that we all believe everybody should not be discriminated by the color of their skin. I hope you examine this issue. We sincerely want an apology for this inconvenience. Sincerely, student.
Dear student, thank you for your message. I'm very sorry this happened to you. I would like to meet in person to discuss the situation further. Let me know when you can stop by. Ada.
Dear Ada, thank you for your kindness. We were all furious about that incident. However, after knowing that there are people who actually care for minorities like us, it gives us pride, knowing that we chose to come to this school. Again, thank you for offering us options to deal with this matter, but we have decided not to make a scene. Student.
Dear student, I don't think you will ever read this message. I do hope at some point you will tell the story on your own. I haven't been able to sleep for days since I received your email. That last sentence, "We have decided not to make a scene," hit me hard. That sentence has filled me with sadness. It feels like someone has driven a knife slowly into my heart. I'm not going to die from it, but my heart aches and bleeds with each gentle cut and push. Your message was the first complaint I received, but it was not the first one I have heard. Since the outbreak of the coronavirus, we have seen an increase of hatred toward Chinese people, people of Asian descent, or Asian Americans in general. Physical assaults have taken place, racial slurs hurled, suspicious looks cast, masks put on specifically when Asian people are present. Otherwise, socially conscious people making jokes and references about the virus and Chinese people. Businesses in Chinatown plummeted due to misinformation, xenophobia, and racism. In a world where racism is often seen between black and white, discrimination, prejudice, racism, and xenophobia toward and against Asians are often taken for granted and normalized that even UC at Berkeley briefly posted something online along the line. Xenophobia is a normal response after the outbreak. Our own president insisted on calling the virus Chinese or Wuhan virus, knowing fully well that the pandemic will bring out pre-existing hatred, xenophobic sentiments, and racist assaults against people of Asian descent. Different universities sent warning emails to students about the virus, yet very few made public statements denouncing anti-Asian racism. We don't label any germ, disease, illness, or virus white when they wiped out Native American tribes. Why do we label coronavirus Asian? This pandemic shows how easily we, as Asian Americans, can go from being model minority to yellow peril in this country within seconds. But what I want to write here is not about the virus. It is about that last sentence of yours. We have decided not to make a scene. I truly see you because you remind me of my younger self, when I used to believe that people would understand where I was coming from and empathize with my position if I were polite enough, respectful enough, articulate enough, or liked enough. And then it dawned on me one day, my degree of politeness, respectfulness, or likability has little to do with whether people can grasp the complexity of issues. For many, they understand them all alone. In my or our culture, I was taught since I was young to be quiet, to not speak up, to not challenge authorities, and to keep peace and maintain harmony. I had to work very hard to develop my own voice and to have one. When I was younger, I tried hard to balance between having a voice and wanting to be liked, having ideas and opinions and being seen too opinionated and loud, and telling people how I really felt and what I really thought, and not wanting to alienate anyone with my truth. I still struggle with that. And I'm in my 50s. The reality is, there's no balance. It is a lose-lose situation for me as a woman. I do have the benefit of racial perception. I'm hardly seen as militant or aggressive as an Asian woman, even when I am, compared to a black woman who can easily be seen as aggressive even when she is simply being assertive. My body, as much as it may be sexually objectified, exoticized, or violated, is not seen as threatening, thus allowing me to freely navigate the world without anyone calling the police on me. And we know the ways our bodies are perceived can have life and death consequences. But the worst part is this. When you don't practice speaking up for yourself, you end up losing the only voice you have, your own. I want you to remember this. Silence can be a strength, but it isn't always a virtue. Being quiet doesn't always bring you peace. Being polite doesn't always keep you out of trouble. Being respectful doesn't always get you the respect in return. Please, learn to tell your own story, as I can't always tell stories for others. Learn to shout on top of your lung. Make a scene. Be the troublemaker. Be the trouble for yourself and others. It's time. It's time. Ada.
I hope that you can now have a better picture of our museum. Don't forget to click on the link below or send us a donation check to the address listed below to support us. With your support, our museum will be able to continue to launch new exhibitions and quality public programming. Any donations will make an impact. Last but not least, our fundraising committee chair, Sui Cheng, would like to say a few words before we conclude tonight's event. Sui, you have the floor.
Hi, my name is Sui Cheng. I am one of the board members and also the fundraising coordinator for the museum. This is my 5th year volunteering in the museum. This is also the second virtual fundraising event during the pandemic. With the COVID-19 vaccine currently rolled out aggressively from the government, I hope we can get back to our normal life soon. The month of May is the Asian American Heritage Month. We tell our museum story and also raise awareness to the recent uptick in anti-Asian harassment, discrimination, and violence across the country. I hope you enjoyed tonight's program. I appreciate those who donated tonight. As a non-profit organization, your continued support is greatly appreciated so we can continue roll out events and exhibit. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.